In the limestone darkness of Qumran cave, 4 scraps of ancient parchment survived in dust and silence. Among them were Aramaic fragments of Enoch, including the manuscript now catalogued as 4Q201. They do not preserve a scientific theory of aging, yet the work they represent places long life inside a moral and cosmic pattern, one in which human years expand or contract according to the condition of the world. That is the basic answer. In 1st Enoch, extraordinary lifespan is not explained by genetics, diet, or hidden medicine. It belongs to an ancient vision of history. Before judgment, the earth is corrupted by violence, illicit knowledge, and the rebellion of the Watchers. After judgment, the righteous are promised peace, fertility, and lives completed without terror. Length of days becomes a sign of restored order. But the pattern is not simple. Enoch himself is linked to the number 365 in Genesis, while his son Methuselah becomes the Bible's longest-lived patriarch. The Enochic writings also describe generations before the flood as living under conditions radically unlike those of later humanity. Then, in a disturbing reversal, the giants born from the Watchers consume the world around them, turning unnatural abundance into destruction. The text does not say that every long-lived person is righteous, nor does manuscript evidence prove that ancient humans lived for centuries. What it reveals is an older question: did these numbers record literal lifespans, symbolic status, or a memory of a world believed to be closer to heaven? The surviving evidence begins not with a complete book, but with a scattered textual history. Portions of 1st Enoch were preserved in Aramaic among the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially in fragments from Qumran Cave 4. These manuscripts date from the final centuries before the Common Era and show that Enochic traditions circulated within Second Temple Judaism long before they were preserved in full by the Ethiopian Church. The most complete surviving version is in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia. Greek fragments also survive, and a small Latin witness preserves part of the text. This matters because 1st Enoch is not a single composition written at one moment. It is a collection of works formed across time, including the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dreams, and the Epistle of Enoch. Different sections approach human life, judgment, and cosmic order in different ways. The lifespan question appears most clearly when these traditions are read beside Genesis. Genesis 5 assigns immense ages to the patriarchs before the flood. Enoch lives 365 years, Methuselah 969. Yet, 1st Enoch does not offer a direct biological mechanism for those numbers. Instead, it expands the moral landscape surrounding them. The Watchers descend, forbidden knowledge spreads, violence increases, and the created order begins to fail. Later passages describe the opposite condition. In the restored world, the righteous enjoy peace, abundance, and extended life. Some translations render the promise as completing the full number of their days. The text presents longevity less as an isolated personal trait than as a consequence of living within a healed creation. But one chronological problem remains. Were the vast ages already literal claims, or did Enochic authors inherit symbolic numbers whose original meaning had begun to disappear? The first clear revelation appears after the violence of the Watchers reaches its limit. In 1st Enoch 10, the earth has been filled with blood. The giants have consumed what humanity produced, and divine judgment is announced against the rebellious beings. Then the scene changes. The land is cleansed, righteousness is planted, crops multiply. Human beings are no longer described as struggling beneath a corrupted order. The text states that the righteous will survive and live long enough to produce vast generations of descendants. It adds that they will complete the days of youth and old age in peace. Longevity here is not presented as an accident of birth. It is the visible result of a world in which violence has been removed and creation has returned to proper balance. Another passage sharpens the image. In 1st Enoch 25, Enoch is shown a fragrant tree whose fruit is reserved for the chosen after judgment. Those who receive it are associated with long life, joy, and freedom from torment. The scene resembles Eden, but it is placed in the future. Humanity does not discover a secret method for extending life. Life is extended because access to sacred order has been restored. Some interpreters read these promises literally, as descriptions of an age in which human lifespans will again become extraordinary. Others understand them as symbolic language for blessedness, dynastic continuity, or life protected from premature death. The text itself does not explain cellular aging, nor does it divide humanity into biological classes. Its concern is covenantal and cosmic. That distinction changes the title's apparent claim. According to this Enochic vision, some humans live longer because they stand within a condition of divine favor, while others are consumed by a world disordered through violence and transgression. But the troubling detail is that the longest-lived figures in Genesis appear before this restoration, inside the very age that ends in catastrophe. So were their immense years a sign of blessing, or evidence that something older and stranger was still operating in the human world? The contradiction becomes sharper when another Enochic tradition is placed beside the promise of restored longevity. In the animal apocalypse, found in 1 Enoch 85 through 90, human history is retold through symbolic animals. The generations before the flood appear as creatures transformed by violence, while the Watchers and their offspring disrupt the boundaries of creation. The vision does not focus on the number of years each person lives. It focuses on what happens when categories meant to remain separate are crossed. That matters because the long-lived patriarchs belong to this same threshold world. Genesis presents them as fathers in an unbroken genealogy, but Enochic tradition surrounds their age with rebellion in heaven, corrupted knowledge on earth, and the birth of destructive giants. Their longevity may therefore signal more than personal blessing. It may mark an era imagined as physically and spiritually different from the one that followed. The Book of Giants. Another Enochic work known from fragmentary Aramaic manuscripts at Qumran intensifies the problem. It describes the giant offspring receiving ominous dreams and learning that judgment is approaching. The surviving fragments are damaged, so they cannot be used to reconstruct every detail. What they do show is that ancient Jewish readers continued to develop the idea that the pre-flood world possessed beings, bodies, and lifespans outside ordinary human experience. Some scholars interpret these traditions as mythic explanations for the distant past. Others see them as theological arguments about disorder, not attempts at chronology. The evidence does not establish that the patriarchal ages preserved literal measurements, but it does show that longevity was embedded in a larger narrative about proximity to creation's beginning. In that framework, living longer was not necessarily safer. The oldest world was also the most unstable. Extraordinary years could mean closeness to primordial vitality, yet that same vitality existed beside forbidden power and escalating violence. The ancient reason, then, may not have been simple righteousness. It may have been distance from the weakening world that emerged after judgment. But if human life diminished as creation became more restricted, what event did ancient writers believe finally set the new limit? The possible turning point is hidden in a single disputed sentence outside 1 Enoch, but inside the biblical world that Enochic writers inherited, Genesis 6:3 declares that the human days shall be 120 years. The phrase appears immediately before the flood narrative, after the sons of God take human women. One reading treats the number as a new maximum lifespan. Humanity, once capable of living for many centuries, is now restricted. On this interpretation, the age of extraordinary longevity closes as divine limits are imposed on a corrupted world. But the wording permits another reading. Some interpreters understand the 120 years as a countdown, the period remaining before the flood rather than a biological ceiling. The later genealogies complicate the first interpretation because several figures after the flood still live beyond 120 years. Abraham reaches 175. Isaac reaches 180. Even Moses, whose death at 120 later becomes symbolically important, does not establish a universal rule. That small ambiguity changes the investigation. If Genesis 6:3 is a lifespan limit, then declining human age becomes part of the judgment connected with the same rebellion expanded in the Book of the Watchers. If it is a countdown, then the text never states when or why. The centuries-long lives gradually disappear. First Enoch does not resolve the grammar. It supplies a theological environment around it forbidden unions, corrupted knowledge, violence, judgment, and the restoration of ordered life. The ancient reason for shortened existence may therefore be inferred from the narrative, but it is not given as a simple decree preserved in an Enoch manuscript. One phrase seems to explain everything. Instead, it leaves two different histories possible, and the difference between them depends on what their days was understood to mean. Modern biology approaches lifespan from an entirely different direction. It studies cells, genes, metabolism, disease, and environment. Researchers have identified processes associated with aging, including accumulated DNA damage, altered cellular signaling, declining repair systems, and the gradual loss of tissue function. None of this confirms the Enochic explanation, yet it reveals why the ancient pattern still feels recognizable. Human longevity is never controlled by one cause. Inherited traits can influence risk, but nutrition, infection, violence, childbirth, sanitation, and social stability also shape how long people survive. A population living through famine and conflict may appear to possess shorter lives even when its biological potential has not changed. A peaceful society with reliable food and protection allows more people to reach old age. That is strikingly close to the structure of First Enoch, though not to its supernatural claims. The text connects shortened life with a world filled by bloodshed, exploitation, and disrupted creation. It connects extended life with fertile land, security, and freedom from premature death. The parallel does not prove that its authors understood genetics or cellular aging. It shows that they recognized a basic truth: the condition of a world enters the body. But modern research also complicates the idea of an ancient decline from centuries to decades. Human remains do not provide evidence for a recent population whose members routinely lived 800 or 900 years. Age estimates from skeletons become less precise in older adults. Yet nothing in the archaeological record establishes the patriarchal numbers as ordinary biological lifespans. The numbers must therefore be examined on another level. They may express honor, ancestral greatness, numerical symbolism, or the imagined vitality of a primordial age. They may also have been understood literally by ancient readers. The evidence cannot determine one universal interpretation. Modern science can explain why safety, disease, and environment affect lifespan. It cannot explain why Enoch lived exactly 365 years, or why Methuselah reached 969. Those figures belong to a literary and theological system whose numerical logic remains contested. And once the manuscripts are compared, the mystery becomes not only how long the patriarchs lived, but why different ancient traditions sometimes preserve different numbers. The disagreement did not begin in modern laboratories. It began when ancient communities decided what kind of authority Enochic writings possessed. At Qumran, multiple copies of Enochic works were preserved in Aramaic. That physical evidence shows sustained interest among at least some Jewish groups in the late Second Temple period. But First Enoch was not included in the later rabbinic Jewish canon. The surviving record does not reveal a single meeting where it was formally expelled. Its status changed gradually as communities transmitted some texts and abandoned others. Early Christians inherited a similarly divided landscape. The letter of Jude quotes a prophecy attributed to Enoch and treats it seriously. Writers such as Tertullian defended the book's value, while other Christian authorities regarded its uncertain authorship and limited circulation as reasons for caution. Over time, most Greek and Latin churches did not preserve the complete work as scripture. Ethiopian Christianity followed a different path. The full collection survived in Ge'ez and became part of the broader Ethiopian Orthodox biblical tradition. That preservation is why modern scholars can read sections lost in complete form elsewhere. The contrast is often described as suppression, but the evidence supports a more complicated history: different languages, institutions, copying networks, and theological priorities produce different canons. This conflict affects the lifespan mystery. Traditions that retained First Enoch preserved a cosmic explanation linking human decline to angelic rebellion, violence, and judgment. Traditions that did not retain it still possess Genesis, but without the same extended narrative around the Watchers, The result was not one interpretation erased by another. It was a narrowing of the textual world available to most readers. When European scholars encountered Ge'ez manuscripts in the early modern and modern periods, the missing context returned. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed that major portions of Enoch had circulated in Aramaic before Christianity. The book was ancient. Its complete interpretation was not uniform. And if communities disagreed over whether Enoch carried scriptural authority, how much confidence can we place in the ancient explanation it gives for the shortening of human life? The surviving manuscripts bring the uncertainty into the present. The Aramaic copies from Qumran prove that Enochic traditions were ancient, but they do not preserve every line in every section. Many fragments are small, darkened, torn, or separated from their original columns. Reconstructing them requires comparison with later Greek and Ge'ez witnesses, and each comparison raises the possibility that wording changed during transmission. That problem matters because the lifespan theme depends on relationships between texts rather than on one complete statement. Genesis supplies the patriarchal ages and the disputed limit of 120 years. The Book of the Watchers supplies the rebellion, violence, and judgment. Later Enochic passages supply images of renewed fertility, peace, and completed days. No single surviving fragment states, in direct terms, that some humans lived longer because they possessed a different biological nature. The mystery, therefore, rests in the structure of the tradition. Were ancient readers connecting these passages as parts of one explanation, or are modern interpreters combining themes that originally served different purposes? Even the chronology is unsettled. Different sections of First Enoch were composed at different times, and scholars debate how their layers developed and interacted. A later writer could reinterpret an older tradition without preserving its original meaning. A symbolic age could become a literal memory. A literal claim could acquire symbolic force. Manuscript imaging and textual comparison can recover letters invisible to the naked eye, but they cannot recover an author's unspoken assumptions. The physical evidence can show that a reading existed. It cannot always show how every community understood it. So the present question is no longer simply why ancient humans were said to live longer. It is whether the Enochic explanation was ever one coherent doctrine at all, or whether its unity exists only because the surviving pieces have been placed beside one another. Now, an important distinction is necessary. The physical evidence proves that Enochic writings circulated in Aramaic during the Second Temple period. The textual evidence proves that these writings connected human corruption, angelic rebellion, judgment, peace, fertility, and extended life within one broad sacred history. Neither form of evidence proves that humans once lived for 900 years, that the Watchers were historical beings, or that modern biology has confirmed the ancient account. Interpretation begins only after those limits are stated. One interpretation sees the patriarchal ages as literal memories of a primordial humanity whose vitality diminished after the flood. Another sees them as symbolic numbers expressing honor, cosmic order, or distance from creation's beginning. A third possibility is that ancient writers inherited older figures whose original meaning was already uncertain, then placed them inside new theological narratives. The strongest evidence supports a more restrained conclusion. In the Enochic world, longevity is not merely a private reward, it reflects the condition of creation itself. When the earth is violent, polluted, and ruled by transgression, human life becomes vulnerable. When order is restored, the righteous complete their days in peace. The text turns lifespan into a moral measurement of the world. If Genesis 6:3 is correct as a new limit on human years, and if the Watcher's story explains why creation required that limit, then the larger question becomes whether shortened life was imagined as punishment, protection, or both. That final possibility is the most unsettling. Restricting human years may have been understood not only as judgment against corruption, but as a boundary preventing corrupted beings from possessing immense power for immense periods. The ancient reason some lived longer would then be that they belonged to an earlier order, closer to creation's original force, before divine restraint became necessary. But this remains speculation. No surviving Enoch manuscript states the theory in those exact terms. The conclusion emerges only when Genesis, Enochic judgment traditions, and declining genealogical ages are read together. And that leaves one final object to examine: the fragment itself. Silent in the cave dust, preserving a story whose largest implication may never have been written down. The fragment remains where the investigation began. A piece of an ancient argument, copied in Aramaic, broken by time, and recovered near Qumran. Its ink does not reveal how human cells age. Its torn lines do not prove that patriarchs lived for centuries. But the manuscript confirms that Jewish readers before Christianity preserved a world in which lifespan, violence, judgment, and cosmic order belong to the same story. That story gives the title its ancient answer. Some humans live longer because they belong to a condition of greater order, blessing, and proximity to creation's intended life. Others die sooner because corruption, bloodshed, and divine limitation have narrowed what human existence can sustain. Yet this is the theology of the text, not a scientific finding. The fragment still exists. So do the numbers 365 years for Enoch, 969 for Methuselah, and 120 years in the disputed sentence of Genesis. They survive as measurements without an agreed scale, precise enough to invite calculation, but distant enough to resist it. Perhaps they were literal ages, perhaps symbols, perhaps both, understood differently across generations. And in the silence between the surviving lines, one question remains: were the ancient writers recording impossible lifespans or describing a world they believed humanity had already lost?